Well, hello and welcome back. Happy New Year. This is going to be the first episode of the 2021 time, and I think this episode is very fitting. In this one, we're going to be talking about the most recent podcast by Richard Wolff called Externalities and Capitalism's Inefficiencies. And I have to be honest, this is, for a professor, this is extremely childish as an argument. So without further ado, let's get into it.
I want to devote today's program to a concept in economics that might sound distant when I first mentioned it. It's called externalities. But it is in fact a very easy idea to understand and an enormously powerful tool to understand our economic system these days. So what is externality and what does it mean in economics? Here's the basic idea. When a capitalist, the kind of key decision maker in a capitalist system, makes a decision to hire and fire someone, to expand or contract the business, to move production here or there, to adopt a technology, all the basic decisions that capitalists make, they make based on an assessment of the costs of making that decision and the benefits. So, for example, if they're going to expand the business, that's going to cost money. Build another wing on the factory, buy some more trucks, hire some more workers. Those are the costs. But then there are the benefits, the output, and the price you can get by selling that output in the market. And what we tell ourselves and what is taught to our children is that capitalists weigh the costs and the benefits. And they only go ahead and do something like fire a worker or hire a worker or expand or contract or choose a technology based on the following simple idea. The benefits have to be larger than the costs, because the difference between them is more or less the profit that the capitalist can get. And being driven by profit, he's not going to do something, he or she, that has a cost greater than the benefit, because then they're losing money. They're going to choose to do only those things where the benefits are greater than the costs in dollar terms, because that yields a profit, and they'll choose among their options and opportunities those which have the biggest difference between the excess of benefit over cost when you compare one to the other. And here comes the big point. It is said that capitalism is efficient because it works this way. It only does what gives you more benefits than costs. Isn't that wonderful? So here comes the answer. No, it isn't wonderful. It is actually nonsense. And let me explain.
So I want to go ahead and address the point that he began his definition of externalities with when a capitalist makes a decision. It is extremely naive to make that statement, because regardless of if it's a capitalist or a socialist, even in democracy, there are externalities. For instance, say that a worker co-op, the form that Richard Wolff likes here, suppose that they decide that they voted as an entity to get into the business of making not only with shoes, but they get into the business of making socks. Something like that. Well, an externality that they're not going to consider, they don't have to consider, it's not part of their business model, is what's that going to do about Hanes, the sock co-op? What's it going to do? When Nike goes into making their own socks like they do, what's it going to do to Puma? That's an externality. Okay? We'll go ahead and continue in just a moment. But it is important that you understand that every decision is a trade-off of, it's a trade-off between costs and a trade-off between benefits, which then become part of the cost. Because giving up benefits giving up potential benefits is a given up cost, an opportunity cost. Okay? So all costs are opportunity costs. That's what you need to understand in the basics of economics. Let's see. All right, we'll continue.
Capitalists don't count the costs and benefits. They only count the costs to them and the benefits to them when they make a decision. And those are not the same as the costs to everybody.
And in a worker co-op, the idea that the co-op is going to consider everyone's, excuse me, but the idea that a worker co-op is going to be able to maintain all the externality costs or whatnot in a society, to think that that's even going to be possible is it's childish. It's absolutely naive. Think about, say, the U.S. government. We have an election every year, right? Well, depending on who gets elected, it matters for Saudi Arabia or Iran. Okay, so whoever gets elected in a democratic society, the Republican choice is much different for Iran than the Democratic choice, and the same for Saudi Arabia and Israel. Okay, there are costs that always exceed, or that are always going to be external to the decision of whatever democratic society you're talking about. That's just a fact. So there's no reason to put the statement that a capitalist is the one making this decision that has these externalities that are not considered.
Let me give you the simplest examples. Suppose a capitalist decides to build a high-rise apartment building on your block, wherever you live, and to locate on the ground floor a big, expensive restaurant. What does the capitalist count? The capitalist counts the costs to him or her as a capitalist. They have to hire workers to build the building. They have to hire people to maintain the building. They have to buy furniture to put in the building. You get the picture. And what are the costs? Well, I just went through them. What are the benefits? Well, it's the people who will come to the restaurant and buy a meal, allowing whoever operates the restaurant to pay rent to whoever built the building, and to collect the rents, if you like, from all the tenants of all the apartments or offices in the building. You get the picture. But now let me point out to you that these costs which the capitalists count are not the only costs. There are other costs that the capitalist does not count. And again, I'll give you the same example. With lots of people coming to the restaurant, which wasn't there before, there's going to be a need for parking. And there isn't enough parking as it is on the street, so people coming to the restaurant will have to use a parking lot. And the sudden increase in demand for the parking lot will allow the owner of the parking lot to jack up the prices to park your car, so that all of the rest of us who live on that block, who had nothing to do with the decision to build a high-rise with a restaurant, we will all suffer a cost of that project, namely the higher amount of money we have to spend for parking our car. But that's just the beginning. There's going to be a lot more traffic on the street when you build a high-rise and a fancy restaurant on the ground floor. And you know what that means? Not to be cruel, but to be honest, cats and dogs are going to get run over in that street in a way they didn't before, meaning an enormous cost, not just financial, but emotional, for whoever those pets live with. or I should say, lived with. I won't go near the question of accidents more likely to happen to pedestrians like me in that block because of a decision I had no control over and could not participate in.
So, regarding his point about someone building a high-rise apartment in the block that you live on, right? Presumably, from his example, he's not talking about he's not talking about him living in a high-rise apartment, but he seems to have the supposition that everybody else lives in single-family homes of some sort, or maybe smaller, apartment buildings or something. But it's not a high-rise. Okay, that seems to be his supposition in that whole hypothetical situation. But if you actually care about definitions, and you're not a loser who plays sophistry because you're a socialist, or you want to be an honest one at least, then let me ask you a question. If I say that you own this house, but I can tell you if the house needs to be bulldozed, I can make the house get bulldozed. Or if I tell you that you have to mow your lawn on these interval days, or if I tell you that, we're going to add some wings onto the house and you're going to have to let other people live there, who really owns the house? It's not really your house. If I tell you that you own money, say $50,000, but I tell you that at any point I get to decide how much, so long as my board members agree, if I get to decide how much you have to give me every month or every paycheck or whatever it is, or I tell you what you have to spend your money on, do you really own your money? No, you don't. It's not really yours. See, the idea behind capitalism, the definitional idea, but really just the definition of capitalism, is private enterprise, private ownership, where industry is controlled by private owners for profit. But if you don't get to control your own house, how can you say you have private control of your house? So let me ask you a question now, okay, in Dr. Wolff's scenario. Who's the one that zoned your area for multifamily housing? Who is it? Because if everybody lived, presumably, in single-family homes on the block, that means that area, in the current situation today, which he accuses of being capitalist, then that area is zoned for single-family homes. It is illegal. It is illegal to build a high-rise, unless, of course, they rezone the area. Unless the city planner or whoever it is rezones it for multifamily housing, and then some developer can come in and build a multifamily home. If you want to call that capitalism, well, then you're just an a-hole. Because what you really are is just, you're playing around with the definitions, because you clearly don't own your own home then. You don't own the neighborhood that you're in, or your plot of land in the neighborhood that you're in. You have to get approval from someone else. You see, in a capitalist society, the developer would have to come speak with you about your home directly. And I'm sorry, but you're not going to build a high-rise apartment in one single-family home. You're going to have to get a group of people to agree to get rid of their homes. A city block worth of people to get rid of their homes. That's what it's going to take. So sure, when he talks about these developers that he calls capitalists, considering that they only consider, the profits of rents and things like that, and then the rent from a restaurant that's down in the lower level and stuff. Yeah, sure, they only count those costs because they're allowed to only count those costs by the government that has zoned your property or your area for multifamily housing. But again, that means that you don't own the zone that you live in, or you haven't agreed to some kind of deal. You're not given the opportunity to agree to a deal in that area. Anyway, we can continue.
Oh, I hope it's beginning to sink in. There are loads of costs. With a new high-rise and a restaurant, the traffic in this street is going to go up. That means the amount of exhaust coming out of the cabs, cars, delivery trucks in our neighborhood is going to go up. And the impact of greater pollution from those vehicles, we well know, is impacting our health, our lungs, our respiratory systems. How many more visits to the doctor will it cost me? How much more medicine will it cost me? Oh my goodness, these are enormous costs. And again, not just in money, but in really valuable things like health and life. The capitalist isn't responsible for any of them, so the capitalist doesn't count them. When weighing the benefits, let's pick a number, $1 million, against the costs. All the capitalist cares about are the costs he has to cover. And let's suppose they're $800,000. He says to himself, great, here's a project that'll bring me $1 million, cost me $800,000. I'll walk away with $200,000 in profit. And the school teacher and the economist who should know better tell you, see, capitalism is efficient. This project got done because profit led a capitalist to do it. You count the costs to the world the capitalist works in, to the community in which he functions. It turns out that the extra parking spaces for everybody, the cost of them, the lost pets, the illness, and I could go on, they're worth much more than $200,000. If you had counted all the costs of the project, they would have exceeded the money, the revenue that project brought in. And therefore the conclusion would have been, don't do it. The benefits to the people in those apartments and to the people who went to the restaurant, worth $1 million. No argument. Those are the benefits. $1 million for the project. But the costs, if you add them all up, are greater. The project shouldn't be done. It's not efficient to use resources in a way where the real costs of doing so exceed the benefits. That's the opposite of efficiency when you do that. Capital.
So in that example that he's talking about there, keep in mind that he is taking as granted that under his, worker co-op, United States of America, whatever you want to call it, this democratic society, he is taking it as granted that families will be okay with breathing in the pollution, and he's also taking it as granted that it's going to be contained within that community. Because if he doesn't take those things for granted, then of course he is creating, with his democratic co-ops and stuff, he is going to create externalities, or his system will create externalities for people outside of the worker co-op. So they would be passing on the buck as well. Now the idea is whether or not they are, going to be so noble as a community to not undertake these kind of projects just because some, person that they have no affiliation with down the street or whatever, or, in some other city is going to bear the burden of these externalities. He has to take that as granted, because if he doesn't, then he is just, assuming there are no such externalities that exist. And it's just nonsense, because we don't know. Back in the 1960s and 1950s, we weren't really aware of the pollution brought about by industrialization. When we started to learn about it, but there wasn't anything done about it until 1970s, And look at asbestos. We didn't know that asbestos was really linked to, was it mesothelioma? mesothelioma. We didn't really know about that until, heck, the late 70s, something like that. I mean, that's why, in 1975, when the trade centers were built, they used asbestos as the fireproofing. And it stayed there. It was still there in the 90s until the towers fell. So it is just a fact that he is, or I should say, he is committing a crime of looking at things with, in hindsight, as 2020, as if those known factors were already known, or that those factors were already known. Those unknown things were actually already known. So, with that, he's also taking as granted in this scenario that this community will have children and wives that won't divorce or that won't grow up to have valued their health more than the job. So it takes that as granted as well. And what I mean by that is, what about the what about in a concrete, in a say a city where concrete is the main production facility, right? Or say, in third world countries or something like that, where they're mining minerals and such like mica, and they have children working in the caves. Okay, maybe those children will grow up one day a little bit better off, to where they don't have to be concerned about putting food on the table for their children, but instead they actually have the free time to ponder, I am sick because of the work I did as a kid. Well, they just might value, maybe, not having that industry at all versus people being in their situation of being sick. But it wasn't a choice they ever got to make. It was a choice their dad made way back when. These kids grew up in a polluted town. So it takes that as granted. His example takes as granted that, future generations won't regret the decisions that their parents made. Anyway, let's continue.
Socialism does it all the time because we don't charge capitalists for all the costs of what they do. And they, by the way, half know it because they go out of their way not to pay them. Let me give you an example. We know that for a capitalist, when looking at hiring a person to work in the capitalist enterprise, makes a decision. How much extra will I be able to sell in the way of producing goods and services and marketing them if I hire John or Mary compared to what I have to pay John or Mary? If I have to pay John or Mary $30,000 a year, but they add to the business of what I have to sell $50,000 a year by what they add in the way of their brains and their muscles, well, then I'll hire them. I'll hire them because I get more in revenue, $50,000, than I pay them, $30,000. And by the same token, suppose the opposite. Suppose it cost $50,000 to pay for John or Mary, who've been working in your company for 5 years. But when you look at it, what they add to your business, what you would lose if you fired them, is only $30,000. Wow. Then it'd be smart to fire them because you saved the $50,000 you would have paid them, and you only lose $30,000 because that's all they added. So you fire them because for you, the only cost of firing them is the $30,000 of output you don't get anymore because they're not there. But here again, let's look at the costs our capitalist doesn't count. Costs that are external to his counting system, external to what a capitalist has to see. Well, if you get fired, here's some costs. You're going to feel terrible. You may need psychotherapy. It's very expensive. You're going to disrupt your family, the impact on your wife, her health, your husband, his health, your children, their schooling. Begin to think of what it means when you fire a human being. The cost isn't just what you, the capitalist, lose when he or she is not working for you anymore. The costs are much larger than that. They're all the costs of unemployment to a person. We know that alcoholism goes up when unemployment goes up, that divorces go up when unemployment goes up, that abuse between parents and children and between spouses, all of those things, those are social costs. They require medical care, psychological attention, police activity, you name it. The social cost of unemployment is way larger than the private cost to the employer, but we allow the private employer, based on what private costs he counts, to make the decision whether or not to fire. That's not efficient. That is inefficient. The externalities are all of the real costs that capitalists don't have to count. And that's why their decisions are fundamentally inefficient. We've come to the end of the...
So, with that example, I guess nobody gets fired in a worker co-op. I mean, that's pretty fantastic when you think about it. You know, you don't get fired. But, unfortunately, that's not the case. Now, admittedly, I have not read Dr. Wolff's book. I've listened to his lectures. I have listened to several podcasts of his. I try to listen to anything that he's actually in that, you know, where he's actually making a point or a counterpoint to capitalism or something, just to hear what asinine things he actually believes about, you know, what the definitional terms are of capitalism. So to suggest that nobody's gonna get fired, no, he says that it's inefficient that a private individual is gonna get to make this decision to fire someone. I guess instead, you know, it's much better for the person psychologically when 50% of a community or more, or 51% of a community or more shit on him and say, no, your product's not good enough for your wage rate, or for, you know, our wage rate, because I guess presumably everybody makes the same, so we're letting you go. I mean, you know, it's like, that's not a kick in the teeth to think that half your community thinks you're worth dick. So with that, you know, I don't think that it carries the same sentiment, you know, whenever just one capitalist says, hey, you know what, because we got to cut costs because, I mean, sorry, these things cost as much as they do to produce, and you cost this much to produce it. We just can't make that, we can't make ends meet with that. I mean, I think that's much more objective than a community who has to tell you that, because it's not a matter of, it's not a matter of whenever 51% of people have to vote on it, it's no longer a matter of objective opinion or objective statement or fact. Instead, it's a matter of subjective opinion. Oh yeah, I think we should keep them on anyway. But ignoring the profit and loss mechanism of that, because I mean, it's just going to be a real fact of so-and-so makes 50,000, but their produce or their production only makes 30,000. The profit and loss fact is you're losing 20,000. And what that means is that either too much, or I should say they cost too much, or the product itself costs too much. And what it means is that other resources need to be redirected towards either production or the cutting of production of this resource. Like if they can only gather 30% or $30,000 for this product that someone's going to charge 50,000 for, then really what it means is that, I mean, society just doesn't desire that product enough to support its ongoing production. So, like, let's say you're producing crowbars or something like that, you know, the real fact is that it costs real resources in the form of iron to produce crowbars, and also it costs real resources in the form of gasoline for heat, or I should say oil for heat, and coal for heat, because those are the typical, you know, plants that are going to be used, or the typical resources that will be used to create smelting plants hot enough to melt iron and keep it hot enough. So there are real community costs that go into this. And whenever when you have an extra plant, even though they're in the red on their income statement, when you have a plant that's creating demand on oil or creating demand on iron or creating demand on whatever goes into making crowbars or something like that, that drives up the price in the market. It says that there's more demand in the market. And as a consequence, everyone in the community, everyone has to pay more for these resources. So that's the importance of the profit and loss mechanism and not ignoring it. If instead they say, well, obviously the community does not desire the product enough to make sense of affording its production, so you don't pay somebody $50,000 to produce something that can only get $30,000 in the marketplace, then in that case, they cut production, and as a consequence, demand for oil goes down, demand for iron goes down. Those resources can then be redirected to other opportunities that may not have been profitable, on the, on the proposed project basis. So a company in the red is actually causing real costs, or I should say, a company in the red is projecting costs onto other entities that perhaps want to go into production, but they can't because their demand is causing too high of a price or too much cost to justify the expense. That's the importance of a profit and loss mechanism, and it's really sad that Richard Wolff really either doesn't seem to understand it or he is just that dishonest. I don't know which one to make of him, but it's a real sad story. But anyway, there you go, folks. There's the destruction of his stupid examples, where he pretends that we live in capitalism when we don't, but he won't stop bitching about it. Anyway, take care. Until next time, I'll see you later.